Welcome everyone to the next issue. I'm your host, The Power Trip, and today we're going to be concluding our 3-week saga of when to and when not to reboot. Over the last few weeks, we went over the very definition of rebooting, went over some examples of companies that have rebooted or did, say, a soft reboot instead of a hard reboot, and even brushed up on a few reasons why the company will reboot or sometimes choose not to. Now, for our grand finale, we're going to be going over some moments when some reboots have worked and some reboots have not. To start off, we're going to go over the very first example I gave beforehand of why a company would reboot. In this case, time passes, and you may be following a comic, say back in the 80s, and all of a sudden it ends, whether or not it actually had a proper conclusion. But you find yourself going years without a new issue, any continuing story arc at all. The book is just done. In some cases later on, a writer or company will pick up the rights to the book again, or say the same old company will have those rights still, and decide to give it a relaunch or reboot. In this case, my example is going to be the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Back in 1985, they had a book called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle Adventures. Now, this one's one of my personal favorites, specifically because it was one of the first comics I ever collected. This book actually started off following up on the television series, but then proceeded to go on its own. The book ran for several years, and after a while it, like several stories do, came to its inevitable conclusion. Now, the Ninja Turtles, obviously at the time, had several other outlets for media, movies, television, video games, several different things, but comics, it kind of bounced around a little bit. They had their Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle Adventures, and then before that they had their original story, comic, which actually had several different writers that were doing their own stories within the book. But nothing is solid or continuity driven as the Ninja Turtle Adventures until several years later down the road. Now, jump ahead to today, and you have IDW's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. This reboot, relaunch, however you want to say it, has actually taken steps to differentiate from the original continuity. As we all know, the Ninja Turtles were mutated with mutagen, as well as Hamato Yoshi, who is mutated into Splinter. Now, in the new series from IDW, not so much a mutation as a reincarnation. The 4 turtles were actually Hamato Yoshi's children and were murdered by the Shredder in the past. Hamato Yoshi and the turtles end up being reincarnated into their current forms, which is a completely re-imaging, I think that's the right term for that, to their history. Now, once again, this is a fine example of a reboot that works. The new book is actually very popular, but it needed to be done. While the creators and writers of the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle Adventures actually do still have their hands in the current projects, they still, time had passed, and a lot of their old readers may or may not still be around. So, kind of like what happened with Hal Jordan and Green Lantern Rebirth, over time, you need to reboot to give new readers a chance to jump on, and give old readers something familiar that will bring them back. Now, similar to the passage of time is also when the rights of a company end up bouncing around a little bit. This example, as you may guess, is Transformers. In this one, Marvel started off with the rights, and over time, not going to get into what caused them to not have it anymore, but the rights to the Transformers bounced from Marvel to, I believe, to a company called Dreamwave. Now, Marvel's books initially followed closer to the cartoon series, and while it did have its own branching points that went away from that continuity, it wasn't until Dreamwave had the rights and relaunched slash rebooted into its own story arcs. Now, Dreamwave kind of did something similar in the sense of a lot of their books more closely tied into the cartoon series at the time. Armada, Energon didn't quite make it to Cybertron before Dreamwave lost their rights as well. Jump ahead again. Now Transformers has been rebooted again under IDW. Following a trend here, by the way. Now IDW has rebooted Transformers also very successfully. I can't recommend this enough, by the way. If you're not following this series, it's actually very spectacular. Now, with the current Transformers series, IDW has actually taken the chance that over time and the constant reboots and company jumps with the product, that with Transformers under them, they have decided to mix the mythology. So now you have Megatron is a former gladiator, while Galvatron is an old war hero that Megatron actually, I won't say hero worshipped at the time, but they're actually two separate entities. You also have the Beast Wars Transformers mixed in with the regular Transformers, as well as several brand new Transformers that actually I'll probably go into later on down the road. But for the most part, both of these are very good examples of companies that had to do a reboot because of time or the product jumping around so much. In both cases, the reboots were very successful and needed to be done. Definitely had to be done at that point. Because, once again, time, your lack of readers, and not even having the same writers anymore for some of this within the realm of continuity. I'm okay with something being on a different planet, different universe, that kind of thing, but for Marvel as my example, the whole ideal of these heroes being the exact same heroes that our parents, possibly even our grandparents in some cases, have been reading the whole time. Peter Parker is still the same Peter Parker that you could look at pictures back in the day and see him dialing on a rotary phone or driving an old jalopy down the road. But today he's handling computers and cell phones just fine, like it's no problem at all. Not to mention the guy looks pretty spry for, what now, a 70-year-old? Let's just say I hope I look as good as he does at that age. Now, Marvel falls on its not needing a reboot because it still uses its tool, the floating timeline. I went over the definition of this in my article, but to sum it up here, it's basically when you're reading a comic and the story says 10 years ago, the whole point of floating timeline is that is 10 years from the moment you were reading it. So if I pick up that comic and read it today, and it says he has a flashback for 10 years ago, or 10 years ago something happened to Spider-Man, that's 10 years from today. Now the point of the floating timeline here is, if I pick up that same comic 20 years down the road, it's 10 years from that point. That's why these are supposed to keep them from having to reboot. It's the same character. That way it works in our current time. The problem with this is that Marvel, much like several other comic book companies, they're not the only ones that do this, but they do integrate certain landmarks or presidents or, other things that show their age. And with this, I really feel like Marvel needs to either perform a reboot, which, your guess is as good as mine on whether or not that the current Secret Wars story is going to be a reboot. But the whole thing is, but if they're not going to do a reboot, they need to follow up on several arcs like what they did with Captain America passing the torch, the separate universe where Spider-Man's daughter took up as Spider-Girl. These arcs that show passing the torch, carrying on the timeline with their age. DC did it originally back in the day with the Golden Age Superman and Batman. Showed their age. Batman even had a daughter, got married to Catwoman. Marvel likes to instead give us separate options. Say, for example, the Ultimate Universe. Their prime way of being able to give us a today Peter Parker and a today Iron Man without having to change that continuity. But once again, my humble opinion, I find this to be a very good example of a book line that needs the reboot, because their crossovers are getting more massive. Over time, these same heroes have managed to defeat the same villains over and over again. And with a reboot, you get a chance to start over. Give the readers a fresh start. Bring in new readers. No longer do you have to worry about making bigger and bigger bad guys to face the Marvel Universe as a whole. Gone today are the times when you could just have a crossover where the Fantastic Four are facing Doctor Doom and that's it. Now every summer, or even not even just summer, but constantly through the year, it has to be what's the next big threat to the entire Marvel Universe, because that's where we've evolved to. The Marvel Universe as a whole, since it's the same old heroes, they no longer need to worry about facing the smaller villains anymore, because they've been doing it for so long, because they are the same characters. This is why I feel it's a prime example of a chance to take that leap and perform a reboot. So finally, I'm going to go into the final part of when not to reboot. And this one primarily is going to get covered by DC, because the only real reason not to reboot is when you just don't need it. You're doing it too many times. And for DC, that is the main issue here. No one can doubt how well the New 52 relaunch has done, or originally Crisis on Infinite Earths. Heck, even to a fault, Zero Hour did fairly well. But following the New 52, only 2 years in, and we're already dealing with Convergence, which scared everybody. Thankfully enough, it was not actually a reboot of the New 52, but just rebooting the multiverse to follow the New 52. But everyone now, when your comic book line pretty much is just a constant joke, is constantly being picked on that, oh, when's the next reboot going to happen? How long can I still follow this Superman anymore? It's probably about time to take what you have and stick with it for a while. Now, DC finally is in a point where they have started New Number One's a full relaunch, and it's groundbreaking. A chance for everyone to really get into new storylines and things that you'd never see before. This would be a very bad time for DC to try and reboot again. They don't need to. They've got exactly what they want to on a multiversal scale in this case. So, with that, I leave you with the examples of when and when not to reboot. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this 3-part adventure, and I've got some special surprises coming up in the long run for you guys, so I'll see you for the next issue.